Welcome to the channel, Stories of Slavery. Today's story takes us to 1849, where we follow Judy, a towering widow who, despite the official end of slavery, was forced to work like a prisoner inside the Vanahog mansion. Her story is painful, real, and nearly forgotten, so please take a breath and listen closely. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. Your voice helps keep these stories alive and remembered. Let's begin. In the sweltering summer of 1849, in a place called Brazoria County in the southeastern corner of Texas, there lived a woman who towered over every other human being on the plantation. Her name was Judy. She stood 6 feet and 4 inches tall, with shoulders as broad as a doorframe and hands that could wrap around a man's skull like he was holding a melon. The enslaved people who worked alongside her in the sugarcane fields called her the Giant. The white overseers who watched from horseback called her Big Judy when they were feeling generous, or simply pointed at her from a distance and said that one. When they wanted her moved from one task to another, she could lift a 300-pound barrel of molasses over her head without bending her knees or breaking her stride. She could work 18 hours straight in the brutal Texas heat, cutting cane until the sun went down, and then carrying bundles to the mill until the moon rose high, and still have enough strength left to walk back to the slave quarters with 2 exhausted children riding on her back. Her arms were thick as fence posts, her legs were like tree trunks rooted in the earth, and her silence was so complete, so absolute, so unbreakable, that some of the newer slaves believed she had been born without a tongue. She had a tongue. She had a voice. She simply chose not to use them. Not anymore. Not since she learned at 7 years old that speaking only gave white people more ways to hurt you. This is the story of that woman. This is the story of how she was enslaved twice by the same piece of land. This is the story of how America found a way to keep her in chains, even after the chains were supposed to be illegal. This is the story of how she survived things that would have killed most people, how she endured suffering that would have broken most souls, and how she eventually found a way to fight back using the only weapon she had left: her memory, her truth, her voice finally unleashed after decades of silence. But before we can understand who Judy became, we need to understand where she came from. We need to understand the place that shaped her, the system that tried to destroy her, and the people who thought they owned her body and her labor and her very existence. The Patton Plantation sat on 13,500 acres of some of the richest soil in Texas. It stretched along the banks of the Brazos River, that muddy brown waterway that had been the lifeblood of agriculture in this region since before Texas was even a state. The land was flat and fertile, perfect for growing sugarcane, and the climate was hot and wet, perfect for the back-breaking labor that sugarcane demanded. The plantation had been established in the 1830s by a family named Patton, who had come to Texas from Kentucky, bringing with them their wealth, their ambitions, and their human property. By 1849, the Patton Plantation, locally known as Patton Place, was one of the largest and most profitable sugar operations in the entire state. The main house was a 2-story structure built by enslaved hands, using bricks that enslaved people had made themselves one by one, mixing clay and water and straw under the brutal Texas sun, firing them in kilns that burned hot enough to blister skin from 20 feet away. Firing them in kilns that burned hot enough to blister skin from 20 feet away. The sugar mill was a massive wooden building filled with giant iron rollers and copper kettles. A place where sugarcane was transformed into sugar and molasses through a process that was as dangerous as it was profitable. In that single year of 1849, the Patton Plantation produced 275,000 pounds of sugar and 22,000 gallons of molasses. Those numbers made Columbus Patton, the patriarch of the family, one of the wealthiest men in Texas. Those numbers were printed in agricultural journals and business reports cited as evidence of what hard work and good management could accomplish in the fertile lands of the Brazos River Valley. What those numbers did not show was the human cost. What those numbers did not reveal was that every pound of sugar was produced by people who had no choice in the matter. People who were worked from before dawn until after dark. People who were beaten when they slowed down and starved when the harvest was poor. People who watched their children sold away to pay debts and their spouses worked to death in the fields. Those numbers were written in sweat and blood and tears. Those numbers were the arithmetic of human misery. Judy was 23 years old in that summer of 1849. She had been born on a smaller plantation in Christian County, Kentucky, in the year 1826, the same year that a man named Martin Varner first settled the land that would eventually become the Patton Plantation. Varner was one of Stephen F. Austin's original colonists, part of the group known as the Old 300, who received land grants from the Mexican government in exchange for settling this wild and sparsely populated territory. Vanna built a log cabin on the banks of the Brazos River and started farming, growing corn and raising cattle, and eventually experimenting with sugarcane. He kept at least 2 enslaved people to work his land. When Vanno sold his property to the Patton family in 1834, he probably did not imagine what it would become. He probably did not imagine the scale of suffering that would unfold on those 13,000 acres over the next several decades. Judy knew none of this history when she arrived at Patton Place. She was 7 years old, small for her age despite the height she would eventually achieve, and terrified beyond the capacity for rational thought. She had been sold away from her mother 3 weeks earlier, purchased at an auction in Louisville by a slave trader who specialized in moving human cargo from the Upper South to the cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South and Texas. The journey from Kentucky to Texas had taken 21 days. Judy traveled in a wagon with 33 other enslaved people, men and women and children chained together at the ankles, bouncing over rutted roads, sleeping in the open air, eating whatever scraps the trader decided to throw at them. She remembered fragments of that journey for the rest of her life. The sound of the wagon wheels creaking, the dust that coated everything that got into your eyes and your mouth and your lungs until you felt like you were breathing dirt. The smell of unwashed bodies pressed together in the summer heat, and her mother's face growing smaller and smaller as the wagon pulled away until it disappeared behind a hill and was gone forever. She never saw her mother again. She never learned what happened to her. She never even learned her mother's full name. In the slave quarters at Patton Place, Judy was simply told that her old life was over and her new life had begun. She was given a new set of clothes, a rough cotton dress that hung on her small frame like a sack. She was assigned to the children's gang, a group of enslaved children between the ages of 5 and 12, who performed light tasks around the plantation, pulling weeds and carrying water, and learning the rhythms of bondage that would define the rest of their lives. She was told the rules. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look white people in the eye. Do not run. Do not fight. Do not cry where anyone can see you. Work hard. Obey quickly. World was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who owned and those who were owned, and that she was permanently, irrevocably, in the second category. She learned that her body was not her own, that her time was not her own, that even her thoughts were suspect if they showed on her face. She learned to make herself invisible, to move through the world without drawing attention, to exist in the margins where the overseer's eyes did not reach. She also grew. By the time she was 12, she was already 5 feet 10 inches tall, taller than most of the adult women on the plantation and many of the men. By the time she was 16, she had reached her full height of 6 feet 4 inches. A towering presence that made her impossible to overlook, despite all her efforts at invisibility. The overseers noticed her. They moved her from the children's gang to the field gangs, putting her to work cutting sugarcane alongside the strongest men on the plantation. She kept up. She more than kept up. She discovered that her enormous body was capable of enormous labor, that she could work longer and harder than almost anyone else without collapsing from exhaustion. This was not a blessing. This was a curse. The more she could do, the more they demanded. The stronger she proved herself, the heavier the burdens they placed on her shoulders. By 1849, Judy had been at Patton Place for 16 years. She had watched children grow into adults and adults grow old and old people die. She had watched families torn apart at auction, mothers screaming as their babies were carried away by strangers. She had watched men beaten until their backs were nothing but raw meat. Women violated by overseers who considered such things a privilege of their position. Old people worked until their hearts gave out in the fields. She had learned every inch of the plantation, every path and every building and every hiding place where you could steal a moment of rest without being seen. She had learned the names and habits of every overseer, which ones were merely cruel, and which ones were genuinely dangerous, which ones could be avoided, and which ones sought out victims with a predator's instinct. And she had met Solomon. Solomon arrived at Patton Place in the spring of 1847, purchased from a plantation in Virginia that had fallen on hard times and was selling off its human assets to pay debts. He was not a big man. He stood 5 feet 6 inches in tall and weighed maybe 140 pounds when he was healthy, which was not often in those years of meager rations and endless work. His skin was darker than Judy's, a deep brown that seemed to absorb light rather than reflected. His hands were slender, almost delicate, the hands of someone who had been trained for housework rather than field work before circumstances changed. When Judy first saw him standing in line with the other newly arrived slaves, waiting to be assigned their quarters and their tasks, she thought he looked fragile. She thought he would not last a year. She was wrong. Solomon was not strong in body, but he was strong in other ways. He had a mind that worked like a trap, capturing information and holding it forever. He had a spirit that refused to be broken no matter how hard the overseers tried. And he had a secret, a dangerous secret that he carried with him from Virginia, a secret that would eventually change Judy's life and cost Solomon his own. Solomon could read. He had learned as a child, taught by a little white girl on his previous plantation who thought it was a game. She was the daughter of the overseer, 8 years old and bored and looking for entertainment. She had been learning her letters from a tutor, and she decided to teach them to the slave boy who brought water to the house each morning. She did not understand the laws that made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. She did not understand the danger she was putting Solomon in. She simply thought it was fun, this secret project, this hidden rebellion against the adult rules that govern plantation life. She taught Solomon the alphabet. She taught him to sound out words. She taught him to read simple sentences from her primer. And then when she was 9 years old, she died of scarlet fever, and the lessons ended, and Solomon was left alone with a skill that could get him killed if anyone found out. He kept the secret for 15 years. He practiced in his head, sounding out words from signs and labels and any scrap of printed material he could glimpse without drawing attention. He read the newspapers that white people left lying around, sneaking glances when no one was watching, piecing together an understanding of the world beyond the plantation's boundaries. He learned about politics and wars and economic forces that shaped the system of slavery from which he could not escape. He learned that there were people in the North who believed slavery was wrong, who were working to abolish it, who risked their lives to help enslaved people escape to freedom. He learned that Texas had only been part of the United States for a few years, that it had once been an independent republic, that before that, it had belonged to Mexico, where slavery had been illegal until American settlers demanded the right to bring their human property across the border. Solomon kept all this knowledge locked inside his head, a treasure chest of information that he could not share with anyone until he met Judy. He noticed her immediately. Of course, everyone noticed Judy. It was impossible not to notice a woman who stood head and shoulders above everyone else on the plantation. But Solomon noticed something else. He noticed the way she watched. He noticed the intelligence in her eyes, the careful attention she paid to everything around her, the way she seemed to be cataloging information, even as she performed the mindless physical labor demanded of her. He recognized something in her, a kindred spirit, a fellow observer, someone who was doing more than just surviving. They were married in the fall of 1847, in a ceremony that had no legal standing under Texas law, but was recognized within the slave community as binding and sacred. An old man named Ezekiel, who had been a preacher before he was enslaved, spoke words over them and asked God to bless their union. There was no ring, no certificate, no official record of any kind, just two people standing before their community and declaring their intention to face the hardships of bondage together. The marriage was in many ways a practical arrangement. Married slaves were often treated slightly better than unmarried ones, given marginally more food and marginally more privacy, and marginally less likelihood of being sold separately. But it was also something more. It was a declaration of humanity and a system designed to deny that humanity. It was an act of hope in a place where hope was dangerous. In the privacy of their small cabin, in the slave quarters, in whispered conversations that could not be overheard, Solomon told Judy his secret. He taught her to read. It took 2 years. They had so little time together, a few hours each night after the day's work was done, and even those hours were subject to interruption by patrols and overseers and the countless unpredictable demands of plantation life. But Judy was a dedicated student, and Solomon was a patient teacher. They scratched letters in the dirt floor of their cabin, erasing them before dawn. They practiced with sticks on the riverbank when they could steal a few moments of privacy. Solomon whispered words in Judy's ear as they walked to the fields each morning, sounding out syllables, explaining meanings, building her vocabulary one brick at a time like they were constructing a house of knowledge in her mind. By the summer of 1849, Judy could read at about a fourth-grade level by modern standards. She could work through a newspaper article slowly, sounding out the difficult words, puzzling over the meanings of phrases she had never encountered before. She could read the signs posted around the plantation, the labels on barrels and crates, the notices tacked to the bulletin board outside the main house. For the first time in her life, the written world was open to her. For the first time in her life, she had access to information that was not filtered through white people's mouths. She also understood for the first time how dangerous her knowledge was. Literacy among enslaved people was illegal in Texas. Teaching a slave to read was a crime punishable by fine and imprisonment. Being a slave who could read was punishable by beating, torture, and death. The system required ignorance to function. Enslaved people who could read might learn about abolitionists in the North, about escape routes through the Underground Railroad, about their own legal rights under Mexican law that had been swept away when Texas joined the United States. They might read newspapers that reported on slave rebellions in other states, on the growing political conflict between North and South, on the possibility of a future where slavery might be abolished altogether. Knowledge was power. Power in the hands of enslaved people was intolerable to those who held them in bondage. Solomon knew the risks. He taught Judy anyway. He taught 4 other enslaved people on the plantation, selecting them carefully, swearing them to secrecy, building a small network of literate souls in the midst of a system designed to keep them ignorant. He believed that knowledge was worth dying for. He believed that the ability to read was a form of freedom that could never be taken away, no matter what happened to the body that held it. In October of 1849, someone found out. The details of how the secret was discovered were never clear. Perhaps an overseer noticed something suspicious. Perhaps one of the enslaved people Solomon had taught said something careless in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps it was simply bad luck, the kind of arbitrary misfortune that governed so much of life under slavery. What was clear was the result. An overseer named Crawford had been watching Solomon for weeks. Crawford was a thin, mean-spirited man with pale eyes and a reputation for creative cruelty. He had noticed the way some of the enslaved workers seemed to share meaningful glances, the way they whispered to each other with a different kind of understanding than the usual gossip and complaints. He had found strange marks scratched in the dirt near the quarters, marks that looked like they might be letters. He had seen Solomon moving his finger across his palm late at night, as if tracing invisible words. Crawford did not have proof. He did not need proof. He reported his suspicions to Columbus Patton, and Patton gave Crawford permission to handle the problem however he saw fit. On the morning of October 17, 1849, Solomon was assigned to work the kettles in the sugar mill. This was highly unusual. Solomon normally worked in the fields cutting cane. He had never worked the kettles before. He had no training in the delicate and dangerous operation of boiling sugarcane juice into molasses and sugar. The kettles were enormous copper vats heated by wood-fired furnaces filled with liquid that reached temperatures of over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The work was done by experienced hands, by men who had spent years learning exactly how to stir the boiling liquid, how to skim the impurities from the surface, how to judge when the sugar was ready to crystallize. Putting an untrained man on the kettles was not just unusual, it was a death sentence. Judy knew something was wrong the moment she heard about Solomon's reassignment. She tried to find him before the workday began, but the overseers kept them separated. She tried to get herself assigned to the mill so she could watch over him, but Crawford personally intervened and sent her to the farthest fields more than a mile from the mill buildings. She worked that day with dread coiling in her stomach, a sick certainty that something terrible was about to happen. 3 hours into his shift at the kettles, Solomon slipped on the wet floor. The floor around the kettles was always wet, always slippery with spilled juice and condensed steam. Men slipped there all the time. Usually they caught themselves on the railing. Usually they walked away with nothing worse than bruised pride and soaked clothing. Solomon did not catch himself. He fell forward, his arms windmilling, his body pitching toward the nearest kettle. His right arm plunged into the boiling sugar up to the elbow. The scream could be heard throughout the mill and beyond. Men who were working at other stations said later that it was the worst sound they had ever heard, a sound that did not seem human, a sound that seemed to come from some deeper place than the lungs or throat. Solomon pulled his arm out of the kettle, and the skin came off with it, peeling away from the muscle and bone like a glove being removed from a hand. The flesh beneath was white and gray and red, cooked meat, steaming in the air. No one called for a doctor. No one provided medical care. Solomon was carried to the slave quarters and laid on his straw mattress, his ruined arm wrapped in rags, his body shaking with shock and agony. Judy was not allowed to leave the fields until sundown. By the time she reached him, he was delirious with pain, his eyes unfocused, his lips moving constantly as if he were speaking to someone only he could see. He lived for 4 days. Judy did not leave his side except when the overseers forced her to. She worked her shifts in the fields, her body moving through the motions of cutting cane and bundling stalks, while her mind remained in that small cabin where her husband was dying. She brought him water that he could not drink. She changed the bandages on his arm that could not be saved. She held his hand through the long nights when the fever took him to places she could not follow. On the 4th day and the hour before dawn, Solomon's eyes suddenly cleared. The fever broke just for a moment, and he looked at Judy with full recognition, full awareness of where he was and what was happening. He squeezed her hand with what little strength remained in his body. "Keep reading," he whispered. "Promise me." Judy nodded. She could not speak. Her throat was closed with grief. "Teach others," Solomon said. "Don't let them. Don't let them." He did not finish the sentence. His eyes lost focus. His hand went limp in hers. His chest stopped rising and falling, and Solomon was gone. Judy did not cry at his burial. She stood at the edge of the shallow grave they had dug behind the slave quarters, in the patch of ground reserved for enslaved people who died at Patton Place. She watched as other enslaved men and women lowered Solomon's body into the earth, wrapped in a tattered blanket, because there was no money for a coffin, no money for a proper shroud, no money for any of the dignities that white people took for granted when they buried their dead. Old Ezekiel spoke words over the grave, the same words he had spoken over their wedding 2 years earlier, asking God to receive Solomon's soul into eternal rest. The other mourners sang hymns, their voices low and mournful, carrying across the fields where they had all labored, and would all continue to labor until the day they too were lowered into this same ground. Judy did not sing. She did not pray. She stood silent and still, her face a mask of stone, her eyes dry as the desert. But inside her chest, something was happening. Something was changing. Something that had been dormant for 23 years was waking up. Something that had been patient was running out of patience. Something that had been broken was reassembling itself into a new and harder shape. She was not angry. Anger was too small a word for what she felt. What she felt was something colder and more durable, something that would sustain her through the years ahead, something that would eventually become her greatest weapon. She felt resolution. She felt certainty. She felt the crystallization of a purpose that would guide every decision she made from that moment forward. She was going to destroy this place. Not the buildings, not the fields, not the physical structures of the plantation. She was going to destroy the system. She was going to find a way to fight back, a way to strike at the machinery of bondage that had taken everything from her. She did not know how. She did not know when, but she knew with a certainty that went beyond faith into something harder and more reliable that she would find a way. She was 23 years old. She was a widow and she was done being a victim. The months after Solomon's death were the hardest of Judy's life. Grief settled into her bones like a sickness that would not fade. She moved through her days in a fog, performing her tasks mechanically, eating without tasting, sleeping without resting. The other enslaved people gave her space, recognizing the depth of her mourning, even though she never spoke of it, never wept where anyone could see, never gave any outward sign of the devastation inside her. But even in her grief, Judy was watching. She was paying attention to everything around her with an intensity she had never brought to the plantation before. She noticed things she had never noticed. She saw patterns she had never seen. She was looking for weaknesses, for gaps in the system, for opportunities that might be exploited. She noticed that the overseer, Crawford, who had surely been responsible for Solomon's death, drank whiskey every night after dinner and passed out by 9 o'clock, leaving the slave quarters effectively unsupervised for the darkest hours of the night. She noticed that the patrol riders who watched the roads and the property boundaries focused their attention on the main routes leading north and west toward the Free States and largely ignored the swampy, difficult terrain along the river to the south and east. She noticed that the slave quarters were built on soft ground that had once been a creek bed, ground that was sandy and loose, ground that would be easy to dig through if you had strong enough hands and enough time, and enough patience. Judy had strong hands. She had time, endless time stretching ahead of her in the prison of bondage, and she had nothing left to lose, which gave her a kind of patience that was indistinguishable from courage. In the winter of 1849, after the grinding season ended, and the plantation settled into its quieter rhythm of repairs and preparation for the next year's planting, Judy began to dig. She worked only on the darkest nights when clouds covered the moon and the stars were hidden, and the overseers stayed inside their quarters drinking and playing cards by their fires. She started beneath the wooden floor of her own cabin, prying up boards carefully so they could be replaced without visible damage, scooping out handfuls of sandy soil with her bare hands. The work was painfully slow. She could only dig for 3 or 4 hours each night before she had to stop and replace the boards and hide the evidence of her labors. She carried the excavated dirt in her apron to the riverbank a quarter-mile away, scattering it in the water, where it would wash downstream and leave no trace. Then she walked back to her cabin, replaced the boards, lay down on her mattress, and slept for 2 hours before the morning bell. By the summer of 1850, she had dug a tunnel 30 feet long. Her plan was simple in concept, but enormously difficult in execution. An old man named Isaiah, who had been enslaved at Patton Place for 47 years before he died in the fall of 1848, had told Judy stories about the land around the plantation. He remembered a time before the Pattons arrived, when he was a young man working for Martin Venner. He had explored the territory along the river, hunting and fishing in the hours when the work was light, and he had discovered a system of natural caves that honeycombed the limestone formations south of the plantation. These caves went on for miles, Isaiah said, twisting and turning through the darkness, eventually emerging somewhere past the county line in territory that was sparsely settled and poorly patrolled. If a person could get into those caves, Isaiah said, they could travel underground for most of a day, coming out in a place where the slave catchers would never think to look. Judy had listened to Isaiah's stories with the half-attention of someone who did not expect to ever use such information. Now, in the wake of Solomon's death, those stories came back to her with the force of revelation. If she could dig a tunnel from the slave quarters to the entrance of Isaiah's cave system, she could create an escape route that bypassed all the normal dangers of running away. No roads where patrols might spot you. No dogs that could track your scent through the woods. No open country where a fugitive would be visible for miles. Just darkness and stone, and the underground river that Isaiah said flowed through the deepest part of the caves. It would take years. She knew that it might take decades. She knew that too. But Judy had stopped thinking in terms of her own lifetime. She was thinking now about something larger, something that would outlast her if necessary. Even if she never escaped through the tunnel herself, she could create a path for others. She could leave behind a gift for the people who came after her, a way out of the hell that had swallowed her whole life. She told no one about the tunnel. Not at first. Solomon had trusted people, and Solomon was dead. Judy trusted no one. She dug alone in the darkness in silence night after night, month after month. Her hands grew calloused and scarred from the digging. Her back ached from the hours spent crouched in the narrow passage. She learned to navigate by touch, to feel her way through the darkness without light, to sense the texture and moisture of the soil to guide her direction. She became something not quite human in those hours, a creature of the underground, a mole in human form. By the spring of 1852, the tunnel was 53 feet long. By the fall of that year, it had reached 62 feet. Progress was slow because Judy could only dig on nights when conditions were favorable, and favorable nights were rare. Too much moonlight and she might be seen. Too much rain and the tunnel might flood. Too cold and the sound of her digging might carry through the frozen air to ears that should not hear it. She worked when she could, rested when she had to, and never, never, never gave up. In the summer of 1853, Judy took her first risk. She told someone about the tunnel. Her name was Mercy. She was 31 years old, the mother of 3 children who had all been sold away from her over the previous 5 years. The first had been a boy named Daniel, sold at age 8 to pay Columbus Patton's gambling debts. The second had been a girl named Hope, sold at age 6 when Patton decided he had too many mouths to feed and not enough work for them all. The third had been a baby just 11 months old, sold along with his nursing mother to a buyer from Louisiana who wanted a matched pair. Mercy had tried to keep her youngest child, had begged and pleaded and offered to work double shifts forever if they would just let her keep her baby. But her pleas meant nothing to men who saw her only as property, as a unit of labor to be managed for maximum efficiency. After that third child was taken, something broke in Mercy. She stopped eating for a week. She had to be forced to work at gunpoint. She tried to drown herself in the river, but other enslaved people pulled her out before she could succeed. Eventually, the immediate crisis passed, and Mercy returned to something resembling normal function. But the light had gone out of her eyes. She moved through her days like a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit, waiting for death without actively seeking it. Judy recognized that look. She had seen it in the mirror after Solomon died. She knew what it meant to have everything taken from you, to have your reasons for living stripped away one by one, until nothing remained but empty duty and endless pain. She approached Mercy one evening as the work gangs were walking back from the fields. She fell into step beside the smaller woman and spoke quietly, almost inaudibly, without turning her head or giving any visible sign that conversation was occurring. "I'm digging a tunnel," Judy said. "Under the quarters. It leads south toward the caves. When it's finished, people can use it to escape." Mercy did not respond. For a long moment, Judy thought she had not heard, or had heard but did not believe, or had believed but did not care. Then, almost imperceptibly, Mercy nodded. "I want to help," she whispered. That night, Mercy became the second member of what Judy had started calling, only in her own mind, the River Road. The name had no particular meaning. It was just a phrase that sounded ordinary, boring, the kind of words that would not raise suspicion if an overseer happened to overhear them. "I'll see you on the River Road" could mean anything, it could mean nothing, and that was the point. Over the following months, Judy recruited more helpers. She was methodical about it, selecting people who had already suffered devastating losses and therefore had little left to fear. She chose men and women whose spirits had been crushed, but not destroyed. People who carried the same cold fire in their eyes that burned in her own. She chose carefully, watching each potential recruit for weeks before approaching them, testing their discretion with small secrets before revealing the large one. By the end of 1853, there were 5 people working on the tunnel. By the middle of 1854, there were 12. The tunnel grew faster now. With multiple diggers working in shifts, progress that had once been measured in inches per night could be measured in feet per week. They developed systems for removing dirt, for shoring up the walls and ceiling with scavenged wood, for ventilating the passage so that workers in the deeper sections could breathe. They established signals and codes for communication, ways of passing information without speaking aloud. They became, without ever naming themselves as such, a resistance movement. By November of 1854, the tunnel was 73 feet long. They were close now, so close. Judy had explored the terrain above ground during stolen moments, mapping the distance to the limestone formations where Isaiah had said the caves began. She estimated they had less than 40 feet to go. A few more months of digging, maybe a year at most, and the river road would be complete. Then everything fell apart. Columbus Patton, who had grown increasingly erratic over the previous years, was declared legally insane by his own family in November of 1854. The details of his condition were never discussed openly, but the enslaved people had their theories. Some said he had been driven mad by guilt for all the suffering he had caused. Some said he had made a deal with the devil, and the devil had come to collect his soul. Some said the ghosts of dead slaves visited him every night, whispering horrors in his ear until his mind cracked like an eggshell under a boot. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Columbus Patton was removed from his plantation and shipped to an asylum in South Carolina, where he would spend the remaining years of his life in a locked room, babbling about things that only he could see. His departure might have been good news for the enslaved people of Patton Place, except for what came next. With the master of the plantation incapacitated, a legal guardian had to be appointed to manage his affairs. The court selected a man named John Adrians, a Brazoria County merchant who owned several smaller farms in the area and had a reputation for shrewd business sense. Adrians took control of Patton Place in December of 1854, and his first order of business was to conduct a complete inventory of the property. Every building was inspected, every piece of equipment was cataloged, every enslaved person was examined, evaluated, and assigned a dollar value based on their age, health, skills, and capacity for labor. Surveyors mapped the boundaries of the plantation with precision that had never been attempted before. Engineers examined the sugar mill, the storage buildings, the slave quarters. One of those engineers, a young man named Franklin, who had been hired to assess the structural integrity of the various buildings on the property, noticed something odd about the floor in one of the slave cabins. The boards were loose. They did not lie flat against the joists the way they should. Curious, he pried one up and looked underneath. He found a hole, a tunnel, a passage dug into the earth that extended beyond the range of his lantern light, disappearing into darkness toward the south. Judy was in the fields when the alarm was raised. She saw the white men on horseback riding toward the quarters, saw other enslaved people being rounded up and questioned, saw the overseer Crawford pointing and shouting and looking angrier than she had ever seen him. She knew in that moment that the river road was finished. Not finished in the sense of being completed, finished in the sense of being destroyed. She did not run. There was nowhere to run. She stood her full height, all 6 feet and 4 inches of her, and she watched them come. She thought about Solomon. She thought about her mother. She thought about the 12 other people who had helped her dig the tunnel, who had trusted her with their lives and their freedom and their hope. She thought about all of them and she made a decision. She would not break. She would not give them names. She would not betray the people who had believed in her. No matter what they did to her body, she would protect them. She would carry their secret to her grave if necessary. They beat her for 3 days. They used whips, leather straps that cut through skin and muscle with each stroke. They used canes, wooden rods that left bruises so deep they turned black within hours. They used fists, boots, and the handles of tools. They broke 4 of her ribs. They dislocated her left shoulder. They knocked out 2 of her teeth. They beat her until she could not stand. Then they propped her up and beat her some more. They beat her until she lost consciousness. Then they threw water on her face to wake her up so they could continue. And through all of it, through every blow and every scream of pain that she could not suppress, they asked her the same questions. Who else was involved? Who else knew about the tunnel? Who else was part of the conspiracy? Give us names. Give us names. Give us names. Judy did not speak. Not one word, not one name, not one syllable of betrayal. In the end, they gave up. They decided she must have been working alone. They decided that a single crazy slave woman had dug a 73-foot tunnel by herself over the course of 5 years, alone in the darkness, motivated by nothing but her own madness. It was easier to believe that than to believe there was an organized resistance movement operating right under their noses. It was easier to blame one person than to admit the entire system of control was failing. They sold Judy to a plantation in Louisiana as punishment. She was loaded onto a wagon in chains, barely conscious from her injuries, her body broken, but her spirit intact. She was 28 years old, and she was leaving Texas the same way she had arrived 21 years earlier, in bondage, in pain, in silence. But the 12 people who had helped her dig the tunnel were still alive. They were still at Patton Place, still enslaved, still suffering, but still breathing. She had protected them. Her silence had saved them. That was the victory she carried with her into exile. It was not much, it was not enough, but it was something. It was proof that they could not take everything from her. It was evidence that even in the depths of bondage, even under the lash, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, she could still choose. She could still resist. She could still win small victories that mattered. Judy spent the next 9 years in Louisiana, enslaved on a cotton plantation called Belter. She kept her head down. She worked hard. She did not dig any tunnels. She did not teach anyone to read. She did not draw attention to herself in any way. She simply survived day by day, season by season, year by year, waiting for something she could not name, something she dared not even think about too directly. That something arrived on June 19, 1865. Freedom. The news came to Louisiana on a wave of whispers. It traveled from plantation to plantation, from field to field, from mouth to ear in the secret language of the enslaved. The war was over. The Confederacy had fallen, and somewhere in Texas a Union general had read a proclamation that changed everything. June 19, 1865. The day that would later be called Juneth. The day that General Gordon Granger landed in Galveston with 2,000 federal troops and stood on a balcony and read General Order No. 3 to the assembled crowd. The order was simple in its language and revolutionary in its implications. All slaves in Texas were free. The relationship between former masters and former slaves was now the relationship between employer and hired labor. All enslaved people were advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. By the time the news reached Belter Plantation in Louisiana, it had already been transformed by repetition and hope into something almost mythical. Freedom. The word passed from person to person like a sacred text, like a prayer answered after centuries of waiting. Freedom. Some people fell to their knees and wept. Some people danced. Some people stood frozen, unable to comprehend that the world they had known their entire lives was ending, that the chains they had worn since birth were being struck off, that they were no longer property but people. Judy did none of these things. She was 38 years old. She had been enslaved for 31 of those years. She had learned through bitter experience that hope was dangerous, that promises made by white people were rarely kept, that the distance between proclamation and reality could be measured in blood and suffering. She did not trust the news. She did not trust freedom. She did not trust anything except her own 2 hands and her own stubborn will to survive. But she walked off Belter Plantation anyway. She did not ask permission. She did not say goodbye. She did not collect whatever meager possessions she had accumulated over 9 years of bondage in Louisiana. She simply put down her cotton sack in the middle of the field, stood up straight, and walked toward the road. An overseer shouted at her to stop. She did not stop. He threatened to shoot her. She did not stop. She kept walking, her long legs eating up the distance, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her heart pounding with a fear. She refused to show. No one shot her. No one came after her. The old rules were collapsing, and no one knew yet what the new rules would be. Judy walked for 3 hours before she allowed herself to believe that she was actually free. She walked until the plantation was out of sight, until the fields gave way to forest, until she could no longer hear any sound of human habitation. Then she stopped. She stood in the middle of a dirt road surrounded by trees, alone for the first time in her adult life, and she laughed. It was a strange sound, that laugh. She had not laughed in years. The muscles of her face had forgotten how to form the expression. The sound that came out of her was rough and broken, more like a cough than anything joyful. But it was a laugh. It was the sound of something long imprisoned finally breaking free. She did not know where to go. She had no family. Her mother was dead or lost forever, swallowed by the vastness of a slave system that separated families without mercy or record. Solomon was dead. The 12 people she had worked with on the tunnel were scattered, sold off, or transferred to other locations after the discovery of the river road. She had no home, no money, no possessions, no connections. She had nothing but her own body, her own strength, her own silence. She was free. But freedom without resources was just another kind of prison. So Judy did what millions of other freed people did in those chaotic months after the war. She walked. She followed the roads and the rumors, looking for work, looking for community, looking for some kind of life that made sense in this new and terrifying world. She picked cotton for wages on a farm in Mississippi, earning her first money, real money that belonged to her and no one else. She washed clothes in Memphis, standing over steaming tubs until her hands cracked and bled. She cooked for a wealthy white family in Arkansas, who treated her almost like a human being, who paid her fairly, and spoke to her with something approaching respect. She saved every penny she could, hiding the coins in a pouch she wore around her neck, building a tiny reserve against the uncertainties of the future. 2 years passed. Judy moved from place to place, never staying anywhere long, never forming attachments that might be broken. She was learning how to be free, and it was harder than she had imagined. Freedom meant making decisions, and Judy had spent 31 years having every decision made for her. Freedom meant taking responsibility for her own survival, and the skills required for survival as a free person were different from the skills required for survival as a slave. Freedom meant facing a world that was hostile to Black people in new and creative ways. A world where the chains had been removed, but the hatred remained. Where slavery had been abolished, but its spirit lived on in laws and customs and the hearts of white people who refused to accept that their human property was now their equal. In the fall of 1867, Judy found herself back in Texas. She had not planned to return. She had told herself many times that she would never set foot in that state again, that she would put as much distance as possible between herself and the land of her suffering. But something drew her back. Maybe it was the memory of Solomon buried in that shallow grave at Patton Place. Maybe it was the memory of the tunnel, the river road that had never been completed, the dream of freedom that had sustained her through so many years of darkness. Maybe it was something she could not name, a pull toward the scenes of her greatest trauma, a need to confront the past before she could truly move into the future. Whatever the reason, she found herself standing on a dusty road in West Columbia, looking at the town where she had arrived as a terrified 7-year-old girl 40 years earlier. The town had changed. The war had changed it. Many of the big plantation houses were empty or abandoned, their white columns standing like skeletons against the sky. Many of the wealthy families who had built their fortunes on slave labor had lost everything when that labor was emancipated. The entire economic system that had sustained this region for decades had collapsed, and no one knew what would replace it. Judy saw opportunity in that collapse. Land was cheap in Brazoria County after the war. White landowners who had lost their enslaved workforce could not maintain their properties. They were desperate to sell, willing to accept almost any price for acreage that had once been worth fortunes. And there were federal programs, imperfectly implemented but real, designed to help freed people acquire land and start new lives. The Freedmen's Bureau had agents throughout the South, helping former slaves negotiate labor contracts, establish schools, and in some cases, purchase property. Judy spent weeks gathering information. She talked to other freed people who had settled in the area. She visited the Freedmen's Bureau office in Houston and spoke with an agent named Harrison, who seemed genuinely interested in helping Black people improve their circumstances. She learned about land prices and legal procedures, and the complicated dance of paperwork required to transfer property from one owner to another. She had never done anything like this before. She had never been allowed to do anything like this before. But she learned quickly, the same way she had learned to read, the same way she had learned to dig tunnels, the same way she had learned to survive. In the spring of 1868, Judy became the owner of 12 acres of Texas land. It was not prime farmland. It was rocky and hilly, covered with scrub brush and stunted trees, not good for cotton or sugar or much of anything except grazing a few head of cattle. But it was hers. Her name was on the deed, written in official ink on official paper, filed in the official records of Brazoria County. Her feet walked on soil that belonged to her. After 41 years of being owned by others, she finally owned something herself. She built a small cabin with her own hands, cutting logs and fitting them together without help from anyone. The work took her 3 months, but she did not mind. Every swing of the axe, every notch carved into wood, every log lifted into place was an act of creation, an affirmation of her existence as a free person capable of shaping her own destiny. She bought 2 cows and a mule from a neighboring farmer. Using the money she had saved over 2 years of wage labor, she planted a vegetable garden, tomatoes and beans and collarded greens, food that she would grow and harvest and eat without anyone's permission or oversight. She attended a church 3 miles down the road where the congregation was all black, and the preacher talked about Moses and the promised land with tears streaming down his weathered face. For 6 months, Judy was happy. It was a strange feeling, happiness. She had almost forgotten what it felt like. She had spent so many years in survival mode, so many years focused only on enduring the next hour and the next day, that she had lost the capacity for joy. But now, slowly, tentatively, that capacity was returning. She found herself humming while she worked in her garden. She found herself smiling at the antics of her mule, a stubborn creature named Moses, who seemed determined to test her patience at every opportunity. She found herself talking more, not a lot, but more than before. She told stories to the children of her neighbors, tales of clever animals and brave heroes that she remembered from her own childhood, from the time before slavery had stolen everything from her. She sang hymns on Sunday mornings, her deep voice joining the chorus of the congregation. She even laughed sometimes, that rough, broken sound that was slowly becoming smoother and more natural. She was 41 years old, and she was finally living. Then, in October of 1868, 3 white men came to her door. They arrived on horseback just after sunrise, their shapes dark against the pale morning sky. Judy was in her garden pulling weeds from between the bean plants when she heard the hoofbeats approaching. She stood up and watched them come, shading her eyes with one hand, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. She had learned to recognize trouble. She had spent 41 years studying the faces and postures of white men, learning to read their intentions from the smallest signs. These men meant harm. She knew it before they spoke a word. There were 3 of them. They wore no uniforms, but they had the look of men who believed themselves to be authorities. They had badges pinned to their shirts, though the badges did not match any official design Judy had ever seen. They had guns on their hips, revolvers in leather holsters worn low on their thighs. They had cruelty in their eyes, the special kind of cruelty reserved for black people who had forgotten their place. The leader was a man named Dawson. He had a thick mustache and a scar across his left cheek, and a voice that dripped with false politeness. He told Judy that she was under arrest. He told her that a local rancher named McCready had reported 3 cows missing, and witnesses had seen a tall black woman leading those cows toward the edge of town. He told her that she was to come with them immediately, that any resistance would be met with force, that she had the right to a trial, but that the evidence against her was overwhelming. Judy tried to speak. She tried to explain that she had been in her garden all day, that her 2 cows were right there in the pasture for anyone to see, that she had never even met anyone named McCready. But Dawson cut her off. He was not interested in her explanations. He was not interested in the truth. He had come to arrest a black woman for cattle theft, and that was what he was going to do, regardless of whatever words came out of her mouth. They put iron shackles on her wrists, the same kind of shackles she had worn as a slave, the same cold metal she had felt against her skin so many times before. They led her away from her cabin, her garden, her animals, her 12 acres of freedom. They took her to the county jail in West Columbia and threw her in a cell and left her there for 3 weeks while they prepared their case. The trial lasted 11 minutes. The judge was a white man named Foster, who had owned 30 slaves before the war and had never reconciled himself to their emancipation. The jury was 12 white men, several of whom had been Confederate soldiers, all of whom looked at Judy with the contempt they felt for any black person who dared to own property, who dared to live independently, who dared to act as if freedom actually meant something. The witnesses were white men who swore with their hands on the Bible that they had seen Judy steal those cows. They described her in detail, her height, her build, the clothes she was wearing. They were absolutely certain. Judy was not allowed to testify in her own defense. The law in Texas at that time did not permit black people to testify against white people in court. Her lawyer, a young white man assigned by the court who had spent perhaps 15 minutes reviewing her case, did not call any witnesses. He did not cross-examine the men who accused her. He did not challenge the obvious inconsistencies in their stories. He simply stood silent while the prosecution presented its case, and then he sat down without making any argument at all. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was 5 years of hard labor. Judy did not cry out when the sentence was read. She did not protest or beg or plead. She stood in the courtroom with her head high and her back straight, the same way she had always stood. And she looked at the judge with eyes that held no fear and no submission. She had survived worse than this. She had survived the loss of her mother, the death of her husband, the destruction of her tunnel, the sail into exile, the years of bondage in Louisiana. She had survived 31 years of slavery and 2 years of so-called freedom that had turned out to be just another trap. She would survive this too. But something inside her hardened during those 11 minutes. Something that had begun to soften during her 6 months of happiness turned cold and sharp again. She had dared to hope. She had dared to believe that the world was changing, that freedom was real, that she might actually live the rest of her life as a human being rather than as property. She had been wrong. The chains had not been broken. They had only changed their shape. Judy was not sent to a state prison. There were not enough prisons in Texas to hold all the people being convicted of crimes in those years after the war. Black people were being arrested in enormous numbers, charged with vagrancy, theft, trespassing, disorderly conduct, insolence, and 100 other offenses that could mean whatever white authorities wanted them to mean. The court system could not process them all. The prisons could not hold them all. So Texas, like other southern states, had developed an alternative, the convict leasing system. Under convict leasing, prisoners were rented out to private businesses, farms, and plantations. The state received a fee for each convict leased. The businesses received labor that cost almost nothing. And the convicts received nothing at all except more bondage, more suffering, more chains. They were not paid for their work. They could not leave. They could be punished by their less ease for any reason or no reason at all. They were worked from dawn until dusk and beyond, fed barely enough to keep them alive, housed in conditions that would have been illegal for livestock. The system was slavery under a different name. It was slavery with paperwork. And Judy was sent to Patton Place. The irony was so cruel that it seemed deliberate. The same land where she had been enslaved as a child, where she had met and married and buried Solomon, where she had dug her tunnel and been beaten for 3 days and sold into exile. The same land where she had first learned what it meant to be property, to be less than human, to be a thing to be used and discarded. She was going back, not as a slave this time, as a prisoner, as if there were any difference. The Patton Place of 1868 was not the same plantation Judy remembered. The sugar operation had been shut down years ago. The cane fields were overgrown with weeds and wild grasses. The great house was showing signs of neglect, its paint peeling, its windows cracked, its grandeur fading into decay. Columbus Patton had died in his asylum in South Carolina in 1856, and his estate had been fought over in court for years afterward. The property had changed hands multiple times since then, passing through a succession of owners who saw it only as an investment to be exploited, rather than a home to be maintained. The current operators of Patton Place were a consortium of businessmen from Houston who had no interest in agriculture. They had leased the property from its latest owner specifically to house convict laborers. They had contracted with the state of Texas to receive prisoners, paying a small fee for each one and then selling that labor to anyone who would buy it. Railroad companies paid for convicts to lay track. Farmers paid for convicts to clear land. Construction companies paid for convicts to quarry stone and haul lumber. The convicts themselves saw none of this money. They were worked until they collapsed. And when they collapsed, they were replaced. The convict barracks had been built on the same spot where the slave quarters once stood. The old wooden shacks had been torn down, but the new structures were no improvement. They were long, narrow buildings with dirt floors and no windows, designed to hold as many bodies as possible in as little space as possible. 40 men slept in one building, crammed onto wooden planks arranged in rows like sardines in a tin. 30 women slept in another, sharing beds with strangers, listening to each other's nightmares. There were no mattresses, no blankets in summer, thin and ragged ones in winter. No privacy, no dignity, no rest. Judy was assigned a bed near the back of the women's barracks. Her bunkmate was a young woman named Clara, who had been convicted of vagrancy, which meant she had been arrested for the crime of being poor and black in the wrong place at the wrong time. Clara was 19 years old. She had been at Patton Place for 8 months. Her skin hung loose on her bones from months of inadequate food. Her eyes had the hollow look of someone who had already died inside and was just waiting for her body to catch up. That first night, In the darkness of the barracks, Clara whispered to Judy. She explained how things worked. She explained that the work started at 4 o'clock in the morning, when guards came through the barracks, banging on the walls with clubs, and did not end until after sundown, when the prisoners were too exhausted to do anything but stumble back to their bunks and collapse. She explained that the food was corn mush and fatback twice a day, never enough to fill your stomach, never enough to sustain the labor demanded of you. She explained that the punishments were savage, whippings for any infraction real or imagined. The sweat box for serious offenses, a tiny wooden cell with no ventilation where prisoners were locked for days at a time in the Texas heat. And the box for the worst offenses, a wooden coffin buried in the ground with only a small hole for air, where prisoners were left to lie in their own waste, unable to move, unable to see, sometimes for a week or more. Clara explained that escape was impossible. The property was surrounded by armed guards and dogs trained to track human scent through any terrain. Anyone who ran was caught. Anyone who was caught was beaten nearly to death. Anyone who survived the beating was put in the box. She had seen it happen 3 times since she arrived. 2 of those people had never come out of the box alive. Judy listened to all of this without speaking. When Clara finished, when her whispered words faded into the darkness and the sounds of other prisoners sleeping or weeping or praying, Judy said only 2 words. "Thank you." Then she closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She lay on her wooden plank and stared at the ceiling she could not see, and thought about where she was and what it meant. She was back at Patton Place. She was back in chains. She was back in the same bondage she had supposedly been freed from 3 years earlier. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution had abolished slavery, except as punishment for crime, and they had made her a criminal. She understood now. She understood what they had done and why they had done it. The white men who ran this system did not care whether she had actually stolen any cows. They cared about putting her back in her place. They cared about reminding black people throughout Brazoria County that freedom was an illusion, that the old order still applied, that any black person who tried to rise above their station could be knocked back down at any time. She was not a prisoner. She was a lesson. She was a warning to every other freed person who might dare to buy land or start a business or live independently. She was also trapped. There was no tunnel to dig this time. There was no escape route to build. There was no hope of freedom at the end of a long passage through darkness. She had 5 years to serve, and every day of those 5 years would be spent in this place, under the control of men who saw her as less than human. But she was still Judy. She was still the woman who had survived everything they had thrown at her. She was still the woman who had dug 73 feet of tunnel with her bare hands. She was still the woman who had taken a 3-day beating without giving up a single name. They could imprison her body. They could force her to labor. They could beat her and starve her and work her until she dropped. But they could not have her soul. Not again. Not ever again. The work at Patton Place was different from the work Judy remembered from her years as a slave. The sugar operation was gone. The cane fields were abandoned. Instead, the convict laborers were used for land clearing, construction, and whatever other tasks the lays demanded. They cut down trees with axes and handsaws. They pulled stumps out of the ground using chains and mules. They dug ditches and built levees and broke rocks into gravel for road construction. They worked in swamps and forests and fields, in heat and rain and cold, from the first light of dawn until the last light of dusk. It was work designed not just to produce results, but to produce suffering. The men who ran the convict leasing program at Patton Place did not think of their prisoners as workers to be managed efficiently. They thought of them as bodies to be used up and replaced. A prisoner who worked at a reasonable pace was beaten for laziness. A prisoner who collapsed from exhaustion was beaten for malingering. A prisoner who complained about conditions was beaten for insolence. The beatings were constant, relentless, a background rhythm of violence that never stopped. Judy quickly became one of the most valuable laborers on the property. Her size and strength meant she could do the work of 2 or 3 ordinary prisoners. She could swing an axe for 12 hours without stopping. She could lift stones that took 4 men to move. She could wade into swamp water up to her chest and haul out logs that had been submerged for years. The overseers loved her productivity. They hated everything else about her. They hated her silence, her defiance, the way she looked at them with eyes that held no fear and no submission. They tried to break her with extra work, with reduced rations, with punishments for infractions she had not committed. She did not break. One overseer in particular took a special interest in Judy. His name was Harlan Briggs. He was 34 years old, a former Confederate soldier who had fought at Shiloh and Vicksburg, and had come home from the war with a limp in his left leg and a darkness in his soul that nothing could satisfy. Briggs was the chief disciplinarian at Patton Place. He was the one who decided when prisoners would be punished, how severely, and by what method. He kept detailed records of every punishment in a leather-bound notebook that he carried with him everywhere, writing down names and dates and offenses in small, precise handwriting. Briggs recognized Judy the moment he saw her. He had been a young man working at Patton Place back in 1856 when the tunnel was discovered. He had been part of the group that beat her for 3 days. He had been the one who finally gave up when she refused to break, who convinced the others that she must have been working alone, who recommended that she be sold to Louisiana rather than killed. Now, 12 years later, here she was again, back at Patton Place, back under his control. On Judy's third day at the camp, Briggs called her to his office. It was a small room in what had once been the plantation's main house, furnished with a desk and 2 chairs and little else. Briggs sat behind the desk and looked at Judy with an expression that was impossible to read. "Sit down," he said. Judy remained standing. I said, "Sit down." Judy remained standing. Her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere above Briggs's head. Her face was expressionless. Briggs smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "I remember you," he said. "The tunnel digger, the giant widow. We beat you for 3 days and you didn't say a word, not one word. I've thought about that a lot over the years. Wondered what kind of person could take that much punishment and not break." Judy said nothing. "I thought we sold you to Louisiana," Briggs continued. "Thought I'd never see you again, but here you are, back at Patton Place like you never left." Judy said nothing. "You know what? I think." Briggs leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I think God brought you back here. I think He gave me a second chance to finish what I started. I think this time you're going to break. I think this time I'm going to hear you scream." Judy looked at him. Then she looked directly into his eyes, something she had not done with any white person in decades, and she spoke. "You can try," she said. "Men like you have been trying my whole life. None of them succeeded. You won't either." Briggs hit her. He came around the desk and hit her across the face with his fist, a hard blow that would have knocked a normal person off their feet. Judy did not move. She did not blink. She simply absorbed the impact, letting her body roll with the force. And then she straightened up and looked at him again. He hit her again and again and again. He hit her until his knuckles were split and bleeding, until his arm was tired, until he was breathing hard from the exertion. Judy took every blow without flinching. A line of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. Her cheekbone was already swelling, but she did not fall. She did not cry out. She did not give him the satisfaction of any response at all. Finally, Briggs stopped. He stepped back, his chest heaving, his face red with fury and frustration. He had expected her to cower. He had expected her to beg. He had expected to feel the thrill of power that came from breaking another human being. Instead, he felt something he had not expected, something uncomfortably close to fear. "Get out," he said. "Get back to work." Judy turned and walked out of the office. She walked back to the worksite, her face blooded, her body aching. She picked up her axe and went back to cutting trees. She worked for the rest of the day without slowing down, without showing any sign of the pain she must have been feeling. That night, in the darkness of the barracks, Clarera asked her what happened. Judy told her. Clarera asked her why she had provoked him, why she had spoken those words, why she had stood there and taken the beating instead of doing whatever was necessary to make it stop. Judy was silent for a long time before she answered. "Because some things are worse than pain," she finally said. "Fear is worse. Surrender is worse. Letting them see you break is the worst thing of all. He can hurt my body. He has been hurting my body my whole life. But he cannot have my soul. That belongs to me. That is the one thing they can never take." Clara did not fully understand. She was 19 years old and had known nothing but fear for as long as she could remember. But she remembered Judy's words. She would remember them for the rest of her life. The years passed. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Judy kept track of time by the changing seasons, by the rhythm of work that varied with the weather, by the new prisoners who arrived and the old prisoners who died or were released. She counted days the way some people count money, hoarding each one, adding them to the total, watching the numbers slowly grow toward the 5 that would mean freedom. She also watched. She watched everything that happened around her with an intensity she had not felt since the days of the tunnel. She memorized names, she memorized dates, she memorized punishments. Who was beaten and when and how severely, who was put in the sweatbox, who was buried in the ground box, who died and how they died and who was responsible. She collected information, storing it in her mind the way Solomon had taught her to store words, building a record that existed nowhere except inside her skull. She was not sure why she was doing this. She was not sure what use the information would ever be. But something in her insisted that it mattered, that these things needed to be remembered, that someone had to bear witness to what was happening, even if no one else ever knew. The people who suffered and died at Patton Place were human beings. They had names. They had stories. They had families who would never know what happened to them. Judy could not save them, but she could remember them. She could carry their names with her like sacred relics, like prayers that might someday be answered. By 1872, Judy's mental record was extensive. She had witnessed and memorized 37 deaths, 37 human beings who had entered Patton Place alive and left it in the burial pit behind the barracks. Some had died from beatings, some had died from exhaustion, some had died from disease, from infections that went untreated, from injuries that festered because there was no medical care. Some had simply stopped living, their bodies giving up, their spirits departing for whatever came next. She had also witnessed and memorized thousands of beatings. The leather whips that cut through skin, the wooden paddles that left bruises the color of midnight, the clubs that broke bones, the creative tortures that Harlan Briggs invented when he was drunk and looking for entertainment. She remembered everyone. She remembered the sounds, the screams, the pleas for mercy that were never granted. She remembered the faces of the victims and the faces of their tormentors. In the summer of 1872, something changed at Patton Place. The brutality, which had always been severe, became even worse. The consortium that ran the facility was facing financial difficulties. The price of convict labor had dropped because there were so many convicts available. They were squeezing their workers harder to maintain profits, demanding more work for less food, punishing any sign of slowing down. Harlan Briggs, whose drinking had increased steadily over the years, became more erratic and more violent. He began selecting certain prisoners for special attention, targeting them for repeated abuse until they died or went mad. One of those prisoners was a young man named Thomas Jefferson Williams. Thomas was 22 years old. He had been convicted of stealing a pig, a crime that may or may not have actually occurred, but that resulted in a 10-year sentence regardless. He was a small man, slight and gentle, with a stutter that made him an easy target for mockery. He had been at Patton Place for 14 months. He had never caused any trouble. He had never broken any rules. But something about him caught Briggs's attention, something about his vulnerability, his fear, his desperate desire to survive, triggered the predator instinct in Briggs's damaged soul. Over the course of 3 weeks, Briggs destroyed Thomas Jefferson Williams. It started with small torments, extra work assignments, reduced rations, public humiliation in front of the other prisoners. Then it escalated. Beatings for imaginary infractions, days in the sweatbox for looking at Briggs the wrong way, beatings for the way he emerged from the sweatbox, too weak and dazed to stand at proper attention. The final assault began on a Tuesday morning in late July. Briggs accused Thomas of stealing food from the kitchen, a charge that was obviously false since Thomas had not been anywhere near the kitchen. He sentenced Thomas to 200 lashes to be administered over the course of 3 days. On the first day, Thomas received 67 lashes. On the second day, he received another 67. By the third day, his back was nothing but raw meat, so destroyed that you could see the white of his spine through the wounds. He received the remaining 66 lashes. Anyway, then he was thrown in the ground box for a week. When they pulled Thomas out of the box, he was barely alive. His wounds had become infected. His body was covered in his own waste. He could not stand. He could not speak. He could barely breathe. Briggs looked at him and decided he had not been punished enough. He ordered another 100 lashes. Thomas died on the 4th stroke. Judy was there. She had been assigned to the work detail near the punishment yard, and she had witnessed the entire 3 weeks of Thomas's torment. She had watched him suffer. She had heard him beg for mercy in his stuttering voice. She had seen the light go out of his eyes day by day as Briggs systematically destroyed him. When it was over, when Thomas's body had been carried to the burial pit and thrown in with all the others, Judy went to Clara. She found her in the barracks, sitting on her bunk, staring at nothing. "Did you see?" Judy asked. Clara nodded. She had seen. Everyone had seen. Briggs had made sure of that. "Remember it," Judy said. "Remember every detail. Remember his name. Thomas Jefferson Williams, 22 years old, convicted of stealing a pig, murdered by Harlan Briggs in July of 1872. Clara looked at her with hollow eyes. "Why? What good does remembering do?" Judy sat down beside her. She took Clara's hand in her own, something she had never done before. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and fierce, and filled with a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. "Because someday someone will ask," she said. "Someday someone will want to know what happened here. And when that day comes, we have to be ready. We have to have the truth, all of it, every name, every death, every crime. The truth is the only weapon we have, and we are going to use it." That night, Judy made a decision that would shape the rest of her time at Patton Place. She was going to do more than remember. She was going to prepare. She was going to assemble a record so complete, so detailed, so devastating, that it could not be ignored or dismissed. And she was going to wait for the opportunity to use it. She began to dig again, not a tunnel this time, a different kind of excavation. She began to gather stories from other prisoners, asking them quietly about what they had seen and experienced, adding their memories to her own. She began to track patterns, noticing which guards were most brutal, which days were most dangerous, which pretexts were used most often to justify punishment. She began to build in her mind a comprehensive picture of the system that held them all captive. 3 more years passed, 3 more years of labor and suffering and death. Judy watched. Judy remembered. Judy waited. In February of 1875, her patience was rewarded. A white minister in Houston named Reverend James Mitchell had received reports from freed people in Brazoria County about conditions at various convict labor camps. Mitchell was a rare creature in post-war Texas, a white man who actually believed that black people were human beings, deserving of basic dignity. He had been collecting testimony for months, documenting abuses at camps throughout the region. He wrote to the governor demanding an investigation. The governor, facing political pressure from northern newspapers that were publishing exposés about convict leasing across the South, agreed to appoint a committee of inquiry. The committee consisted of 3 men. They were not reformers. They were not particularly sympathetic to the plight of black prisoners. They were politicians and businessmen who had been assigned an unpleasant task and wanted to complete it as quickly as possible. But they had the authority to visit convict labor facilities to interview prisoners and guards and to report their findings to the governor. When Judy heard that investigators were coming to Patton Place, she knew her moment had finally arrived. The investigators arrived on a warm March morning. They were met at the gate by the facility's manager, a man named Caldwell, who had replaced the previous manager 2 years earlier. Caldwell was smooth and polished, a man who knew how to present a favorable impression. He gave the investigators a carefully orchestrated tour of the grounds. He showed them barracks that had been hastily cleaned the night before. He showed them work sites where prisoners had been instructed to move slowly and hide their injuries. He showed them the kitchen where a special meal of actual meat and vegetables was being prepared for the first time in months. The investigators asked polite questions. They took notes. They nodded at Caldwell's explanations. They were preparing to leave, satisfied that they had done their duty, confident that their report would describe conditions as challenging but acceptable. Then Judy stepped into their path. She had positioned herself near the gate, knowing the investigators would pass that way on their departure. As they approached, she moved out of the shadows and stood directly in front of them, blocking their way. She was 58 years old, gray-haired and weathered, her body bearing the marks of decades of hard labor and harder punishment, but she was still 6 feet 4 inches tall. She was still impossible to ignore. "You want to know what happens here?" she said. "I will tell you." Caldwell rushed forward, his face flushing red. "This woman is a troublemaker," he sputtered. "A convicted criminal. Nothing she says can be trusted. Guards, remove her immediately." 2 guards moved toward Judy. The younger of the 3 investigators, a man named Harrison, who had kind eyes and a notebook clutched in his hands, held up his hand to stop them. "Wait," he said. "Let her speak." The other 2 investigators exchanged glances. One of them, an older man named Crawford, who was chairman of the committee, seemed ready to dismiss Judy and continue on his way. But something in her eyes stopped him. Something in the way she stood, the way she looked at him, the absolute certainty in her bearing. "5 minutes," Crawford said. "She has 5 minutes." Judy spoke for 3 hours. She did not rush. She did not ramble. She presented her testimony with the precision of a lawyer and the authority of a witness who had seen everything and forgotten nothing. She began with Thomas Jefferson Williams. She described the 3 weeks of torture in excruciating detail. She described the 200 lashes administered over 3 days. She described the week in the ground box. She described the 100 additional lashes that killed him. She gave dates. She gave times. She gave the names of the guards who had administered the punishment under Harlan Briggs's orders. Then she moved on. She told them about Mary Turner, beaten so badly for dropping a bucket that she lost the use of her right arm. She told them about Samuel Green, 15 years old, worked to death clearing stumps from a field. She told them about Elizabeth Washington, who died in childbirth because no medical attention was provided. She told them about James Monroe, who was shot in the back while supposedly trying to escape, though everyone knew he had simply collapsed from exhaustion. She told them about Harlan Briggs. She told them about his leather notebook. She told them about his drinking. She told them about his special punishments. She told them about the pattern of selecting certain prisoners for destruction, methodically tormenting them until they died. And then she told them about one particular prisoner, a man whose name she did not know because he had arrived recently and died before anyone could learn it. This man had been punished for failing to meet his work quote. Over the course of a single month, he had received 604 lashes. 604. She had counted, she had watched, she had remembered. The investigators made her repeat the number. She repeated it. They asked her if she was certain. She was certain. They asked her how she could possibly remember such a specific figure. She told them. "I remember," she said, "because someone had to. These people lived. These people suffered. These people died. They had names. They had families. They were human beings. And nobody else was going to remember them. So I remembered every single one, every name I could learn, every beating I witnessed, every death I saw. I carried them all. For 7 years I carried them, and now I am giving them to you." The investigators were pale by the time she finished. Their hands trembled as they wrote in their notebooks. The older man, Crawford, who had been skeptical at the start, looked like he had aged 10 years in 3 hours. The younger man, Harrison, had tears in his eyes. Caldwell tried to intervene several times during Judy's testimony. He called her a liar. He called her insane. He demanded that the investigators disregard everything she said. But her testimony was too detailed, too specific, too obviously the product of genuine memory rather than fabrication. And when Harrison asked Caldwell directly whether any records existed that might corroborate her claims, Caldwell's hesitation was answer enough. The investigators left Patton Place that afternoon. They returned the following week with armed guards and a warrant. They arrested Harlan Briggs. They arrested Caldwell. They seized the facility's records, including Briggs's leather notebook, with his meticulous documentation of punishments. They compared Judy's testimony to the written records. Everything matched. Every date she had given was correct. Every name she had provided appeared in the official documents. The number of lashes she had counted matched the numbers Briggs had recorded in his own handwriting. Her testimony was not just credible, It was corroborated by the perpetrator's own records. The investigation's final report, submitted to the governor in the summer of 1875, used the phrase "particular cruelty" to describe conditions at Patton Place. It documented the 604 lashes given to a single prisoner. It documented deaths from beatings, from overwork, from starvation and disease and neglect. It recommended the immediate termination of the convict leasing program at the facility. The convict leasing program at Patton Place was shut down. Harlan Briggs was removed from his position, though he was never criminally charged. The prisoners were transferred to other facilities, or in some cases released early on account of the conditions they had endured. Judy was among those released. She had served 7 years of her 5-year sentence. The extra 2 years had been added for various infractions, including insolence, failure to work, and disruption. Those charges would never be officially removed from her record. But she was free again. For the second time in her life, she was walking out of bondage into an uncertain future. She walked out of Patton Place on a September morning in 1875. The sun was rising over the fields where she had labored as a child, as a young woman, as a prisoner. The same fields where Solomon had taught her to read. The same fields where she had dug her tunnel. The same fields where she had watched Thomas Jefferson Williams die. She walked slowly. Her body ached, her joints were stiff, her back was a map of scars. But she walked with her head high and her shoulders straight, the same way she had always walked, the same way she had walked when she was 7 years old and arrived at this place for the first time. She did not look back. Judy spent the final 16 years of her life in a small community of freed people near Houston. She worked as a laundress and a cook. Then, as her body aged and her strength faded, as a teacher, she taught children to read, passing on the gift that Solomon had given her so many years before. She taught them the same way he had taught her, scratching letters in dirt when paper was scarce, sounding out words in whispered conversations, building their knowledge one brick at a time. She never married again. She never had children of her own, but she helped raise dozens of children in her community, and those children remembered her. They remembered the giant woman with gentle hands and sad eyes. They remembered her stories, which he told rarely but powerfully, tales of survival and resistance, and the unbreakable human spirit. They remembered her voice, deep and slow and careful, choosing each word like it was precious, like words were treasures to be hoarded and spent wisely. Some of those children lived long lives. They had children of their own and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they passed down the stories. The story of the giant widow who was enslaved twice by the same piece of land. The story of the woman who dug a tunnel with her bare hands. The story of the woman who remembered everything and used her memory as a weapon. The story of Judy. She died in 1891 at the age of 64. She was buried in a small cemetery outside Houston, in a grave marked by a wooden cross that rotted away within a few years. No official record of her death survives. No newspaper printed her obituary. No monument was erected in her honor. To the world of official history, she was nobody. Just another black woman who had lived and died in the margins of American life. But she was not nobody. She was Judy. She was the tunnel digger. She was the witness. She was the woman who stood up in front of powerful white men and told them the truth, and whose truth brought down a house of horrors. She was the woman who refused to break, who refused to surrender, who refused to let them have her soul, no matter what they did to her body. She was the woman who remembered the names of the dead and carried them with her like sacred relics, like prayers that were finally answered when she spoke them aloud to men who had the power to act. The land where she suffered is now a historic site. The Varner Hogg Plantation State Historic Site welcomes thousands of visitors each year. Archaeologists dig through layers of soil, uncovering fragments of the past. They find pottery and tools, and the remnants of buildings that enslaved people built with their own hands. They find evidence of the convict leasing program that replaced slavery with something barely distinguishable from it. They try to reconstruct the lives of the people who lived and died on that land. But they have not found Judy. She exists only in stories. She exists only in the memories passed down through families who survived what she survived. She exists only in the truth she told to 3 investigators on a warm March day in 1875. And that truth still matters. It matters because it reminds us that systems of oppression do not end simply because laws change. Slavery was abolished, and it was replaced by convict leasing. Convict leasing was reformed, and it was replaced by other systems. The names change, the paperwork changes, the justifications change, but the underlying reality, the use of power to exploit and brutalize vulnerable people, continues in different forms. It matters because it reminds us that ordinary people can resist. Judy was not a general or a politician or a famous activist. She was a woman who had been denied education, denied freedom, denied basic human dignity for most of her life. And yet, she found ways to fight back. She dug tunnels. She memorized names. She bore witness. She spoke truth to power when the opportunity finally arose. She proved that even the most powerless person can make a difference if they refuse to give up. It matters because it reminds us that memory is power. The people who ran Patton Place believed they could do anything they wanted because no one was watching, because no one would remember, because their victims were invisible and voiceless. Judy made herself into a witness. She made herself into a living record of their crimes. And when the time came, that record brought them down. This is the legacy of Judy, the giant widow of Patton Place. Not buildings or monuments or official recognition. Something more important. A story that refuses to die. A truth that keeps being told. A reminder that even in the darkest times, even in the most hopeless circumstances, the human spirit can endure, can resist, can triumph. She never stopped standing tall. She never stopped telling the truth, and she never, not once, not ever, let them see her break. That is the lesson of her life. That is what she left behind. That is what we carry forward generation after generation, story by story, truth by truth, until the day when the chains finally break for good and no one ever has to endure what Judy endured. May that day come soon, and may we all find the courage when our moment arrives to do what Judy did, to remember.